See, record. Okay, looks like it's going. Can you guys see my screen okay? Is it sharing? Okay, good deal. All right, so we're continuing our discussion with the topic of God being slow to anger. And I just want to say that I really enjoyed the conversations that we had around God's compassion and his grace last week. And I wanted just to go back to a couple of slides from that discussion, because it's going to be crucially important to remember those two characteristics of God as we go through tonight's discussion. But we talked about God having compassion and how it's related to this Hebrew word for womb. This idea that God's compassion comes out of his nurturing side, it evokes the image of tender care. And we really see that all throughout the Bible. But we also talked about the fact that compassion is often in contrast to emotions such as anger. So that's important to remember, especially as we talk about God's anger, because we'll talk about just the fact that God gets angry at all can sometimes be a hang up for people. It's great to think about God being slow to anger, but just it's a little bit hard for some people to reconcile the fact that God is compassionate, he's gracious, he's loving, he's kind, he's caring, but he also gets angry. But that's not an uncommon thing that people deal with, because people are kind and compassionate and gracious and generous at times, and they also get angry. And it's just difficult to kind of reconcile our notion of anger and how we sometimes express our anger and how we sometimes deal with it, and also reconcile that with how we feel about God being angry and how God gets angry. So also, I kind of think it's interesting that slowness to anger is presented as a characteristic here. I would almost say that that's not a characteristic, not in the same way that compassion and grace are, but we know that anger can be a characteristic. We know that somebody can be angry, but also being slow to anger it might be a little bit of stretch. I might rather say patient. So that's kind of what I think about when I think of God being slow to anger. But we'll start up again. Thanks for joining us again tonight. And I'm really excited about this discussion again. I encourage you all to interject your thoughts and comments just at any point you feel like it. So the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in loyal love and faithfulness, keeping loyal love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. But he by no means leaves the guilty unpunished, responding to the transgression of others by dealing with children and children's children to the third and fourth generation. Some opening questions, just have a few for us tonight as we get started. First one being, what do you think it means to be slow to anger?
Obviously, it means, obviously, I think you're going to make the point that God's anger is a righteous anger and it's not impulsive like we sometimes do when we fly off the handle about certain things that we shouldn't be angry about. So it's almost like when it's time to get angry, he gets angry, but beyond that, he's not impulsive.
Yeah, I like the way that you put that. When it's time for him to get angry, he gets angry. We'll talk about that. The video talks about the way they talk about it in Hebrew is having a long nose. And I won't steal their thunder there on that, but that's kind of interesting. Just start thinking about that, what that might mean. But yeah, being slow to anger. pretty obvious, right? But at the same time, it's something to think about related to the timing of God's anger and the time that he decides to get angry. It's something that he has control of, whereas we may not necessarily have control over such a strong emotion. Okay, so just start thinking about the differences between the way that we experience anger and the way that God does. What makes you angry?
Mm.
What you side there? Just it sounded like anything and all of the above.
Depends on how I'm feeling. Sometimes.
Yeah, it's very, yeah, for sure. Anybody care to share? Mary Beth says bad grammar.
I can get some pretty quick road rage. Not gonna lie, I can get bad behind the wheel.
Yeah, I'm not very patient with other people.
I was commenting to Sheila over this past weekend. I was out driving around doing errands, particularly in the Hickson area. It's like some of these people, it's crazy. I don't think it made me angry. It could be frustrating for sure, but I guess it could lead to anger.
I really love to tell this story on my dad. We had some goats when we were growing up. It's just too perfect not to share with this topic. But we had some goats growing up, and they got out on a Sunday morning. They were all the time getting out, but this one in particular was particularly bad. Just we couldn't get them in. We were out running around. We were running late to church. Dad was in his dress clothes. I was in my dress clothes. We were headed to the car, and he ran after the goat up a hill and fell on his face just right there in his dress clothes, and turned around back at me and just yelled at me, "Go get my gun." I was like, "Dad, you're going to church, you're about to teach Sunday school. Let's not do this right now." So, yeah, I mean, yeah, we come up with all kinds of situations that we find ourselves in. But this is what I think about it. Well, it's what Aristotle thought about it. But anybody can become angry. It's easy. But to be angry with the right person to the right degree at the right time for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not within everybody's power. And it's not easy. All right. So we have a hard time with it. What are the results of your anger? Okay. Well, going back to the goat story, it might be embarrassment. Might be, you upset somebody in the wrong way. You might, just any kinds of things. It could be constructive, but not very often. What do you guys think? Anything to share on that?
I would say a technical foul.
Ooh, yeah.
Not something I'm particularly proud of, although it's kind of laughable now when you think about it. But yeah, just lose your cool playing basketball or coaching and say something that's a little bit out of tune with what the ref needs to hear, and he tees you up, and then that's an embarrassing thing because not only is it personally embarrassing, but it hurts your team, and it just makes you look bad. So
Agreed.
that's my story. No, not something I'm proud of.
Well, thanks for sharing. Yeah, it's most of the moments where I have publicly expressed my anger, I regret. So not usually a good thing. So here's what a quote that I associate with this. There are two things, there's two things a person should never be angry at: what they can help and what they can't. Things that happen in life only fall into those two categories. Okay, so if you can't get angry at either one, you should never be angry, right? Something to think about. All right, so we'll watch the video and then regroup after that.
If you tried to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently describe God's character in this way. compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. We're going to look at this third phrase, that God is slow to anger. Now, that might surprise some people. Isn't the God of the Bible mostly angry, striking people down for their sins? Well, it turns out that God's anger in the Bible is way more nuanced than that, and way more interesting. In Hebrew, the phrase slow to anger is pronounced erek apayim, or literally long of nose. But what does God's patience have to do with a long nose? Well, first, we need to look at the common biblical Hebrew way to say that someone is angry. Their nose burned hot. Like in the story of Joseph, when Potiphar thinks that Joseph tried to sleep with his wife, his nose burned hot. It's usually translated, his anger burned. It's describing how your body, especially your face, gets hot when you're filled with anger. And so in Hebrew, the main words for anger are either nose or heat or hot nose. This is why a patient person is called long of nose. It takes a long time for their nose to get hot. Like in the biblical proverb, a person's wisdom is their long nose. That is, their slow anger. Now, in the Bible, God gets angry numerous times, but God doesn't have a nose or get hot. These are metaphors, using our experience of hot anger to describe how God feels when he witnesses human evil. Just like you would get angry if you saw a child being bullied on the playground, so God gets angry when humans oppress each other and ruin his world. In the Bible, God's anger is an expression of his justice and his love for the world. But he's slow to anger, which means he gives people lots of time to change. Like in the story of the Exodus, when Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites and has their baby boys thrown into the waters, God sends Moses to confront Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's given 10 chances to let Israel go free, but after the 10th refusal, Pharaoh rides out with his chariots to destroy the Israelites, and so God destroys him in the waters. Pharaoh's own evil is turned back upon him, and we read that this is an act of God's hot anger. Now, that's really intense, but think about it. God wouldn't be good if he didn't get angry at Pharaoh's evil and eventually do something about it. And notice that God's anger is expressed by handing Pharaoh over to the consequences of his own decisions. And this is actually how God's anger is shown throughout the scriptures, like in the story of the Israelites. Over and over again, for hundreds of years, they betray the God who rescued them from slavery. And though he gives them many chances to turn around, they keep giving their allegiance to the gods of other nations. And each time we read that the hot anger of God burned against the Israelites. But notice what always follows. God gave them over into the hands of their enemies. Israel wanted to serve the gods of other nations, and so God, in his just anger, gives them what they want, as those nations circle back and defeat Israel. This is similar to what the Apostle Paul says in his letter to the Romans. He says God's anger is being revealed against human evil, and then 3 times he says what that looks like. God hands people over to their destructive desires and decisions, even if it leads to death. But Paul also says God is patient, giving people time to come to their senses and change. Because remember, God's anger is a response to human evil, and it's based on a deeper character trait, his compassion and his loyal love. God is not content to let people sit in their own self-destruction. In the Bible, God's on a mission to rescue. This is why Jesus said that he was going to Jerusalem to die, as a demonstration of God's love for his enemies. He would stand in the place of his people who were choosing self-destruction and take the consequences of their decisions upon himself. In Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, we see God's anger at evil and his love for people working together to provide forgiveness and life for a humanity lost in self-ruin. So God's anger in the Bible is really important, but it's not the end of the story. When God is angry and brings justice, it's because he's good. And he's extremely patient, working out his plan to restore people to his love. And that's what it means to say that God is slow to anger.
Yeah. I could just end the class right there. I feel like that that video was really well put together, and and explain exactly what the main point is. God is not, he's not going to let people sit in their own in their own consequences, in their own destruction. He wants to intervene, but he is just. So that's the main tension, and that's the main tension that we've been discussing during this entire class of how does a compassionate, loving, slow to anger, loyal, loving God deal with a people who are consistently rebellious. So it's really easy to understand God's anger when we look at it through that perspective. But just to make sure we're all on the same page with this, and just talking through what anger looks like in our lives versus what God's anger looks like. Let's just have this discussion so that we can appreciate exactly what it is God has done for us. Okay, so you may have seen this before, but on the whole spectrum of human emotion, some people have distilled it down to this wheel where we've got 6 main emotions, and out from that we've got pretty much a good description of what we experience as people. But we see anger, the wedge for anger on this, in between the wedges for fear and sadness. Okay, so take what you will from that, but supporting this idea of anger, you can work your way out, work your way in. If you want to start with a specific and get generalized, or start generalized and get specific, this is really helpful if you have a hard time identifying what it is you're feeling in any given moment. But anger spans this entire spectrum, okay, that we see at the top, from hate to being revolted. Okay, so we've got rage, which we pretty much well establish anger with, but even beyond that, hate and hostility kind of inform what rage looks like. Same with exasperated. Agitation and frustration support what exasperation looks like. Irritability is right there in between being exasperated and being envious. Envy is right there in between irritability and disgust. Okay, so you kind of see how the spectrum works. All these things are related, but some are closer together than others might be. But generally, this is kind of what we think of when we think of anger. Somebody just kind of blowing their top, little angry guy. But beyond that simplicity is all these other emotions that we give anger to hold as baggage. Anything on this spectrum could be attributed to that, and so therefore anything on this spectrum we could attribute to God. You can look through this list and kind of see that, yes, we can think verses where God is revolted at somebody's actions, or God is disgusted, or jealous. Okay, we know that God is a jealous God. So if he's jealous, is he also therefore angry? And that's the question that we're trying to address here through our human interaction with anger, even though it's completely different from God's perspective. So that's where we kind of get the problem of God's wrath and why people have such an issue with the Bible. When they think about God being angry and God being an angry God, they look at the Bible in such a way that every time they see anger, they're coming into it with all this baggage that they give the emotion. Our own human experience informs the way that we read the Bible and the way that we understand God. So when we see that God's hot anger is burning against somebody, remember the video described God's anger as heat, burning in their nose. So kind of that feeling that you have in your face when you get angry. When they see that in the Bible, when they see God's wrath or justice being carried out, they struggle with that. Why would a loving God, why would a compassionate God even have anything to do or associate with that? Because they read verses like this. Okay, so Numbers 1, chapter 11, chapter 11, verse 1. The people complained about their hardships. That's all they did. Okay, this is how somebody might read this verse. Okay, they only complained in the hearing of the Lord. And when God heard them, his anger burned, and the fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. Really? I mean, that's exactly how somebody would read that. And so we have this problem as we go through the Bible and trying to understand why God would bring fire down on people who complain. Well, we know when we look at that verse, we've got the entire context of Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Exodus leading up to that, where the people have been constantly complaining, longing for their slavery in Egypt, and crediting other things for what God has done for them, and not being patient, not being grateful or anything. It's taken them 40 years to get to this point, but it's kind of like what Tommy said, when God is finally angry, he enacts his anger in such a way that it makes a statement. But we see this time and time and again with the Bible, but if we take it out of context, if we just line them all up together, it creates a portrait of God that is not fair. It's imbalanced, it's distorted. But people do this regularly, and it's something that we need to be prepared for. So with that in mind, talking about the way that we experience anger, it means something different to us individually. Every time we think about anger, think about that spectrum of emotions. Based on our experience, we may think something completely different about anger. We might think of anger as protection. Okay, our emotions are important, they're valid, and they inform us. So if we think about anger as a physical response that our bodies generate when something we value feels threatened or lost or compromised, we can understand that anger looks like that. If the stakes are higher on something and we get angry about that, that's something that we can understand. But we also experience anger in a form of abuse sometimes. Okay, if somebody that we're working for is angry against us and trying to coerce us into doing something we're uncomfortable with or haven't done to their pleasure, that may be a negative form of anger that we've experienced. We might have experienced it losing self-control. Okay, talking about that technical foul. I mean, that's a moment where that a lot of people experience, where it's just a moment of a lapse of judgment, loss of control, and something happens that you can't control. But these are very common primary psychological perspectives on anger, but they have deeply influenced the way that we talk about anger and the way that we conceive it, the way that we evaluate it, most of all. Okay, so when we come to the Bible, how we react to God's anger depends heavily on our life experience, and our disposition to faith in general depends heavily on our life experience, and that's universal. And it's completely different for people outside the church or who are not familiar with the idea of God getting angry justly. It's kind of strange to think about a distant, all-powerful sovereign having absolute power, enacting anger on a helpless people. But as we go through the Bible, we've got to understand that there's nothing volatile about God's expression of anger. It's completely predictable. It's not something to be constantly in fear of. You're not going to get a lightning bolt striking you unless you're actively involved in something that God's against. We've got to remember our conversations about God's compassion and his graciousness, because the more accurate picture of God is as a generous, creative Father, and his anger is measured. His anger is fair. It's reasonable, and it has everything to do about his goodness, everything to do about his justice and his fairness. So we really just need to clear the deck sometimes of our emotional baggage with these emotions whenever we try to apply them to God. Okay, so number two, we're limited in the way that we can describe God. We've got to think about the facts that we're limited to our own experiences when we think about God. So God's got to use human emotions to get to us. So it's a clear analogy using this idea of a long nose, heat. But it's kind of like the way that David describes God as a good shepherd. Okay, is God actually up in heaven guiding around some sheep? No, we're the sheep. Okay, it's a metaphor. But number two, it's exceptionally challenging to combat this. Okay, God enacts himself in a very intimate way throughout the Bible. His presence is well known, but he's also transcendent and above everything that we understand as humans. God doesn't reveal himself in an abstract manner. He's personal, and he's moved, and he's affected by what's happening in the world. Things that we do bring him joy. Things that we do bring him sorrow. It brings pleasure or wrath. He's not detached. He's intimate, and greatly grieved or moved or enjoys us greatly. So it's just altogether kind of difficult to describe God in human terms, but ultimately that's kind of what we're left with, and we've got to have some grace around that. Any thoughts so far? Okay. And I gotta say too, just about God's anger in general, it's of all the things that we can attribute to God, his anger is probably the one that's been denounced the most. God's anger is often pictured as sinister or evil, but the truth is, I mean, that's not the essence of God's anger. Okay, anger is evil if it's associated with malice. If somebody's using it kind of as anger is abuse, but God's anger is morally necessary.
And Matt, I think what complicates this is that we excuse our own behavior sometimes and forget that God is God, and if he gets mad, there must be a righteous reason for it, not one that, you know, we try to get God off the get God out of trouble sometimes when there's no need to do that, and we try to excuse ourselves, and neither one of those is going to work. We're going to have to accept God for who he is, and try to figure out what he's upset about, and prevent ourselves from going there, right? So that complicates things.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's talk about that topic of, you know, just of the people in the Bible who have gotten themselves in the way of God's anger. The first time that phrase appears, what do you think? Where does it come up first? I might think the garden. I might think the flood. I might think, I mean, Cain and Abel, Noah, Lot. We've got the entire book of Genesis to get through, and then some before we actually see God's anger. Doesn't come up until Exodus. That might be shocking. The fifth time that Moses rejects God, God gets angry, but he doesn't get punished. He doesn't experience a violent act. He gives Moses what he asked for. So that's interesting to see. A couple other times. All right, so the Israelites credit God's anger for Pharaoh's destruction. Okay, so that's somebody else giving God credit for being angry, even though God did not himself say that I'm angry over this. But the first time that we actually see something happen as a result of God's anger is Exodus 32. And this is where it's associated with some violence and punishment of the people who made the golden calf. Okay. You see it again later on in Numbers. As it kind of going through the entire wilderness over and over again, complaining, grumbling. God gets angry at several different times. Okay. So let's see. Okay, you guys are seeing that whole slide at once there. Okay. Yeah, so the way that I've kind of put this together, I don't necessarily mean that anger does not equal judgment. I kind of just mean that anger does not lead to judgment, and also judgment does not lead to anger. Okay. Said something a couple minutes ago about God not being detached. But when it comes to judgment, it's very passive, very matter of fact. If something evil has happened, God's goodness necessitates judgment. Okay. And so the pattern that you see throughout the Bible is that God has established order. Something has happened with disobedience to this order. Judgment comes about as a result of that disobedience. Okay. And then the people who were disobedient are given over to their consequences. And we talked about the idea of grace last week being that, you know, we're not feeling the full effect of our consequences. Okay, so this is all tied together, the way that we feel about grace and compassion and God's anger and his love, because this is the natural order of judgment. Okay, you think about creation and the way that God ordered everything. It's the ultimate order. He put the world together. Adam and Eve were disobedient. They ate the fruit, and then they got expelled from the garden. And as a result of that, it has nothing to do with God wanting them to toil and have mortality. It has nothing to do with the fact that that this is a type of punishment. It's not like he wrote the law to say that, yes, okay, when you are expelled from the garden, I must make it in such a way that you will toil and have mortality. No, that's the natural order here. God's intent was for them to stay in the garden. But because they ate the fruit, they were expelled. As a result, their consequences were toil and mortality, much to God's displeasure. Okay. Same way with Cain. The natural order was, okay, Cain and Abel are going to have offerings. Okay. And then it splits here. I mean, there's kind of another subsect here where Cain did not do what was pleasing to God and Abel did. But along that bottom line, Cain did not give offerings that were pleasing to God. He became jealous of his brother, murdered his brother. His brother was bleeding on the ground, and I think the way the Bible puts it is cursed from the ground. Okay, so this could probably be considered the judgment moment. But as a result of all this, his consequences were that he gets exiled. Can't stay with Adam and Eve and the rest of his brothers and sisters. Okay, not after he's killed his brother. He's got to go. But murder is a capital crime. Okay, later on in the Bible, those who murder are stoned. Okay, it's a capital punishment crime. But in this first murder, God's merciful to Cain. Doesn't strike him dead, doesn't end his life, but sends him out to deal with the consequences of his sin. But he goes out and he protects him. He puts the mark on him, says anybody who deals with Cain in such a way shall be dealt 7 times over. Okay. The flood, again, creation happened. Humanity is depraved. God's very displeased. He's to the point of sorrow and grief. Okay, but most of our English translations say something to the effect of God has decided to bring about the end. This is an unfortunate translation. Okay, what it says literally is the end of all flesh has come before me. It's a passive statement. And I encourage you to take a look at the New English translation on this. There's a great footnote that describes the translation and different ways it could be translated. But ultimately, what God is saying here is, I see that there is a natural order of things, and the natural order of things is that because humans are depraved, they're running themselves into the ground. And so God's act of sending the flood, our perspective on that completely changes with that realization, because we know that it's motivated by grief, and it's almost like he's being merciful. He's starting over, because at the point of depravity that these people had at the point of the flood, there's no hope for them coming back from that, except for Noah. And God decides to start over from Noah. And so this idea continues to come up through scripture over and over again, even in the New Testament. And Paul refers back to it, Romans, and we'll take a look at this later. I've really got to hurry up because I'm running out of time here. But God gave them over to desires of their heart, dishonorable passions, and a depraved mind in chapter 1. And that's the thesis of Romans, is that, God has a natural order of things, but Jesus interrupted that order or took our place when in the necessity for judgment. Okay, so we'll talk about that idea just a little bit later. Okay, so a couple of observations about God's anger. God warns Moses. Okay, he says these people will prostitute themselves to foreign gods. And notice again, keep this pattern in mind: order, disobedience, judgment, giving over to consequences. 4 stages. These people will prostitute themselves over to foreign gods. Okay, the order that God had was don't do that, but they did. Okay, and he warns Moses and says these people will prostitute themselves. They will forsake me and break my covenant. Okay, there's the disobedience. The judgment is that was wrong, and in that day my anger will burn hot with them. Consequences: I will hide my face from them. Many disasters and calamities will come on them. God can have nothing to do with the people who are disobedient to the point of unrepentance. If they're unrepentant and unwilling to continue in the covenant that he's established with them, God can't help but hide his face and burn in his hot anger against them. It's the only way to have somebody who's truly lost come back is to hit rock bottom sometimes. There's really not much more you can do about that. So this is how God's anger is expressed: through withdrawal of divine providence and power, which exposes them to the forces of disorder. God's anger is his just and measured response to the covenant betrayal of his own people. Okay, in the same way that a marriage might fall apart because of infidelity, same way for God's people and their relationship to God. They were the ones who committed adultery against God, and they're the ones who are going to deal with God's turning away. Okay, it's not volatile, it's not unpredictable, it's not explosive, it's not abusive. It's just the way of things. Okay, but as we continue to see this happen time and time again, it just becomes a consistent response that God's anger gets expressed as alienation from his presence. And that's really the way that we describe sin, is separation from God. That's kind of why we do it. It's because God can have nothing to do with that. But I mean, ultimately, that alienation, even though it might seem like a punishment, it's what the guilty are pursuing in the first place. If you're actively involved in sin, actively pursuing the things that God is against, you're already pursuing alienation from God. You're just going to get what you want. Okay, so God being slow to anger. Here's the good news. God's going to put up with that. God's going to continue to put up with that. Up to the point that the person hits rock bottom, survives, comes back, and is repentant. Okay? And he's going to deal with it for much longer than is reasonable. The only unreasonable thing about God is his love for us, when you think about it. God will always accept people who turn to him with soft hearts and genuine humility, no matter what they've done. And we see that too. All right, so what about the New Testament? I'm going to kind of skim through this so we can kind of start wrapping this up. But and there was a whole another section in the reading from the Bible Project about the prophets that I just left out entirely. But both John the Baptist and Jesus talk directly to Israel, even in the New Testament. Okay, so if we remember the way that the Israelites went through different captivity at different points, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, just all throughout history. In Jesus's time, it's culminated in the Romans, and they are the destructive force that God will use as his instrument of wrath. So John is warning the leaders of Jerusalem and using several different texts from the Old Testament to describe them. It all goes back to the Old Testament. And warning them that if they don't turn away from their hypocrisy, if they don't turn away from leading the people astray, if they don't turn away from relying on the Roman government and pursuing pleasure and hedonism and all the things that culture stood for, they're going to face the same wrath that all of their predecessors faced. Jesus says the same thing as he's going out to send his disciples and warning of judgment. He's including that same kind of idea. He's identifying specific cities that need to watch out. And then he talks about Jerusalem specifically, about how no stone will be left on another stone because of what the Romans can do to them and the way that God intends to use them as his force of wrath. And that's a whole other topic, whole other class. But as Jesus comes on the scene, he very clearly establishes himself as the way that God will relent from that destruction. And it becomes so much bigger than just Israel at this point, because Jesus, as intercessor, again, in that role, steps into the role of taking on God's wrath. Okay, so he provoked the authorities and called them out in a very effective way so that he could drink the cup of God's wrath that was coming. And what God's wrath meant in the Old Testament and continued to mean in the New Testament was that God's wrath would hand them over to their Gentile oppressors because of the covenant violations that they continued to do. But what Jesus does is he puts himself in the crosshairs. Okay, he puts himself in the crosshairs of the Romans as they're getting rowdy in Jerusalem. Several different times of rebellion and insurrection. Jesus steps up in this moment to be kind of the scapegoat. And so you think about how the crowd cried out for Barabbas. Okay, Jesus took Barabbas' place. Jesus was sent to death as an insurgent king. He never made any claim to be that. But an actual insurgent is allowed to go free. Okay, so he takes the place of Israel. But that's not the end of the story. Okay, we know that Jesus is broken on the cross, but clearly that the same playbook plays out: order, disobedience, judgment, consequences. Okay, except it all gets poured out on Jesus. The natural order of things is God would like a covenant with his people. The Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. A great sin on behalf of the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death. Okay, that's the judgment that he got. And he will get handed over to the Gentiles. But because we're enacting this order on Jesus, he is essentially standing in place of us as God would like to enact that order on us. But 3 days later, he will rise. Okay, and because of what God has done, we'll be completely saved from our consequences, which is a really great thing. So as we get into Romans, this idea really comes up in Paul's writing. But as you read through Romans chapter 1, Paul talks about the righteousness of God being revealed. Okay, the righteousness and the wrath of God, two sides of the same coin, but that's the order of the universe. But they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of incorruptible humans. That's the disobedience. Okay. And Paul is quoting Psalm 106 from there. So the judgment, therefore God gave them over to the lusts of their hearts. God gave them over. Consequences. Their hearts became impure. They had degrading passions and a senseless mind. That is the general, that's the whole story of humanity in a nutshell. Israel's idolatry is the paradigm for all humanity. Everything that we have done to oppose God comes up against us. It demands justice. And that's why we talked about last week with how important it is for us to understand what grace is and how it's couched in God's slowness to anger and how it's couched in his compassion and his loyal love. The fact that he keeps coming back to us, running back to us. The fact of the matter is, God must punish sin. God must punish evil. Unless God remains implacably opposed to the evil that distorts and defaces creation, God is not good. Okay? But wrath is not a permanent part of God's nature. It's something that we provoke. It's something that we arouse because of our misconduct. But it's not naturally part of God's person. God's justice is a part of his person. But God is not in a constant state of anger. His love and his holiness are part of God's essential nature. His wrath is contingent and temporary. And so by the time that we get to Romans chapter 5, this whole dynamic takes on a completely new meaning because of Jesus and because Jesus is in the picture. Because just at the right time, while we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Not only is this so, but we also boast in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. Okay, so Paul is referring back to his argument in Romans chapter 1 here. God has handed the nations in Israel over to death because of their idolatry, which led to sinful degradation. But the Messiah demonstrated God's love for us by going into death on our behalf in order to deliver us from the degradation of our humanity. In God's mind, God's own love answers to his wrath through the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. God saved us from his own wrath through Jesus, rescuing us from being handed over to death. God is not content to let people sit in their own self-destruction, and he shows an abundance of compassion. He's slow to anger. He shows grace, even when we deserve judgment, and even when we deserve to be turned over to the consequences of our failures. So just something to dwell on this week is Romans chapter 5, and just how important it is in the whole grand scheme of things. Because this is really the whole of the gospel. I mean, we can take a look at God's character and try to help people understand that God is not angry, and we can talk about our emotions and everything like that. But until we truly understand what it is that Jesus has done for us, we've got no idea what a bullet we dodged and how merciful our God is. So, any other thoughts tonight?
Matt, I would just say, and you've kind of said this in essence the last few minutes, but the awareness of God's anger over my own sin makes me appreciate his grace and mercy even more than ever. So I think it's what's important that we do consider his anger and what provokes his anger, if you will.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I will dismiss us in prayer. Thank you again for joining tonight, and we will have another session, this exact same discussion Sunday morning, 9 o'clock. Thanks again for joining, and I hope this was uplifting and useful to you. Let's pray. Father, we are so grateful to you for turning away your anger from us and pouring it out on Jesus. We fully recognize that our sin comes up to you as terrible and abhorrent in your sight, but we ask for you to rescue us from that and to help us turn back to you in moments where we want to harden our hearts. We just ask for you to constantly be in front of us, to go before us, and lead us back to you. Thank you for your mercy, and thank you for your love, and thank you most of all for the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt. Really
Thanks,
appreciate
Matt.
it.
Thanks, brother.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night.